Hello and welcome to Profiles and Issues, the Westchester cable television talk show that gives you in-depth interviews with prominent people in the news. I'm your host, Dennis Rudin. Our topics for this broadcast are: 1. How will the recently passed New York State Property Taxpayer Protection Act result in lower property taxes for Westchester residents? How will it help the county government balance its 2019 budget within the 2% budget cap? What has County Executive Latimer done to increase attendance and upgrade Playland Park this summer? How much more is the county spending to upgrade its roads and infrastructure? Will these additional expenses imperil balancing the 2019 budget despite the 1% sales tax increase? Why is the 2020 census important to Westchester residents, and how does it impact their lives? To discuss these and other topics on this broadcast is my special guest, County Executive George Latimer. George, welcome back to Profiles and Issues.
Dennis, nice to be with you.
And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule.
I'm happy to do it.
To appear. George, did Christmas, Hanukkah, and Ramadan come early this year for the county with the state government's passage of the Property Taxpayer Protection Act? Will this legislation lower or freeze current property taxes for Westchester residents?
Well, it is good news, Dennis, that this passed. The state legislature and the governor signed it into effect. I think it was on June 30th when he actually took the act. Here's basically the reality. If you go back to when I began my tenure, January 1st of 2018, we asked the state controller to send in a team of people to take a look at the fiscal stability of Westchester County. They had evidenced in a previous report, they call it a stress report, that Westchester was one of the 4 or 5 most financially concerning jurisdictions in New York State. And other major counties are in the same boat, the Nassau and Suffolk and so forth. Because of the pressure on raising revenues to meet needs for mandated programs that the state requires us to do. So when we called the state controllers people and they took a solid look, they said the same thing that the bond rating agencies on Wall Street said, was that Westchester County did not have a sufficient stable revenue stream to rely on to meet its obligations. Now, most people don't care about that. They care about their tax rate, their property tax rate. And if you walk up to anybody and you ask them how much you're paying if you own property, how much you pay in property taxes, they'll tell you the number, $15,000, $50,000, whatever that number is. They won't necessarily be able to tell you all the services of county government, and they certainly can't tell you what's mandated by the state of New York, but they know how much they pay. So for the prior 8 years, all of the focus was on making sure that you didn't pay any more, regardless of what the impacts were. But the impacts had become serious. So it wasn't, Christmas Day or Hanukkah guilt. This was an opportunity to stabilize the financial realities of the county going forward. In our first budget a year ago, just about a year ago, the one we're operating under now, we were able to deliver a budget in the vicinity of $1.9 billion overall, and to do it with a property tax that stayed under the tax cap of 2%. Now, you can look at communities large and small, towns, cities, villages all over the county. A number of them went over the tax cap, and some of them stayed under, but stayed under with a higher number. Putnam County, Rockland County, both were about 2.5, 2.8% property tax increase. My first budget in Westchester was a 2% increase. But in doing it, we had to take some decisions. We had to make some one-shot financial proposals and so forth. So when we went to the state, we laid out a game plan in which we equalized sales tax rate across the county. Didn't raise it above what it had been previously in White Plains, Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, Yonkers, but we equalized it across the board. We were able to capture revenue over the course of this year and the next 2 years, a year and a half, that will allow us to freeze property taxes. And if we're lucky, a lot of it depends on the economy, we may be able to lower property taxes the next 2 years. I promised a tax freeze. I don't want to promise what I can't deliver. Right now, we're all concerned that we may be seeing a recession come into play. We don't know. None of us knows. Even the economists don't know. So rather than overpromise and promise a tax cut if we don't know we can deliver it, I promised a tax freeze, property tax freeze, and we will deliver that in the 2020 budget as we deliver the budget to the Board of Legislators. This year's 2019 budget is balanced. We've been able to balance it without any of the one-shot deals because we have the revenue that we've just described. We will be able to not have to sell off from one part of county government to a separate entity, the land around the parking lot around the county center. We won't have to take that transaction. That's a one-shot deal. That's not an ideal way to balance the budget, although it was legal to do that. We're not going to have to bond for our tax reimbursements to businesses. They're known as certiorari's, the Latin term. And we're not going to have to borrow for pension costs this year. Those things are all good fiscal policies, so much so that in the aftermath of this, the Wall Street rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, sent out letters with an optimistic view for the first time in a couple of years about Westchester's fiscal stability. So what we did with this proposal, and we went through a long period of time, I've explained it in a host of different areas, is that we showed that by getting an equalization of tax rates, so that if you buy something in Wacabuck, it's the same tax as in White Plains. If you buy something in Newcastle, it's the same price tax-wise, percentage-wise in New Rochelle. It's the same now across the county. Yonkers is still a little higher, but every place else is equalized. And so to that extent, with that simple action, the revenue that generated was sharing back significant money to the municipal governments, an extra $1 million this year to Greenburgh Town, $2 million additional revenue next year to the town of Greenburgh. They don't have to do anything other than collect the money, decide how to use it. We think we've made a very rational plan here.
All right. Now, just to clarify again, I know you've stated numerously, but not everybody gets to see the news all at once, you know. Mm-hmm. It raises the state sales tax on consumer items, what, 1%, right?
The current level of taxation was 7 3/8, and as of August 1st, it is now 8 3/8. What that means is this: if you buy a $100 item, you paid $7.38 for that item in taxes. Now, if you buy the same $100 item, you pay $8.38 in taxes, an additional $1 on taxation for every $100 you spend. And for most people, when you buy things, since it's a consumption tax, you can regulate how much you spent by how expensive you buy an item. If you go out and buy a pair of sneakers, if you go out and buy a chair or a lamp, and you think that the lamp is too expensive for you at $100 and you're paying $8.38 worth of tax, you can buy the $80 lamp and you can save the amount of taxes you pay. It's a consumption tax. With your property taxes, you get a bill and you have to pay that amount, whatever that is. And if you and I live next door to each other and our houses look exactly the same, the fact that I might be making more money than you doesn't change the tax level. We both have to pay the same tax. So property taxes are more regressive than sales taxes. Now, the county is not in a position to deal with income tax. That's a privilege of the state and the federal government. So from our standpoint, we're comfortable that we've done something that we think in the broad basis of things will work out well.
All right. How much estimated revenue will be generated from the tax? I've heard various figures, 70 million for the remaining this year.
Well, it is an estimate because you're estimating how much economic activity will happen, and you can't be 100% sure. The busiest sales time of the year, everybody knows, is at the end of the year, the holiday shopping season, Christmas, gift giving, and so forth. The second biggest time of the year for purchasing is back to school. So those two areas fall within the second half of the year. We've estimated that before the end of the year, Westchester County will generate for its coffers in the vicinity of $40 million of additional revenue. Now, that money will undo the $23 million of the one shot that we identified at the county center. It will also undo a couple of the other items we've mentioned. What we've also committed to doing, which we think is very good fiscal policy, is to put $5 million in our reserve fund, basically our savings account, this year, in the year, and $10 million more in the savings account next year. That'll get us from $65 million to $80 million. That's important. How much do you have to get back into the reserve fund total? We think, to be responsible, we should have a reserve fund in the vicinity of $150 million. And a reserve fund is just like your savings account. You want a savings account big enough to handle a major surprise. If the boiler breaks in your house, if your car has an engine seize, you have a significant amount of money you have to turn to it, you turn to your savings account. You don't want that savings account driven down to such a low level that you can't handle it. We have a $1.9 billion budget. That's a pretty sizable budget. We need to have at least $150 million put aside in the savings account. Now, we've eaten into that over the last 4 or 5 years. Before I got here, there was a number of different reasons why. It's not worth explaining all of the details, but suffice to say, for the last 3 years, the county has gone into their savings account. So now, for the first time, we're putting money back into the savings account. It's at $65 million as a round number. It's going up to 70. It's going up to 80, and we intend to make that the direction. And we think, Dennis, over the course of the next couple of years, it'll raise our bond rating. If we have a higher bond rating, that means we're more credit worthy. And if we're more credit worthy, we pay less in interest every time we have to borrow money. Just like a person when you have a higher credit score. The higher your credit score, the less interest you pay on what you borrow.
So how does Moody's and these other financial institutions, is it an annual evaluation?
It's an annual assessment, usually done at the end of the year. We have a meeting usually in November. Usually I've done it once, but we have a meeting in November, and they analyze a lot of economic indicators, and then they make a decision as to how to rate us. Right now, we're rated as a AA1 bond rating, which is a high rating, but we were at AAA, so we were downgraded to AA1, and there's been a negative outlook attached to us because of the past policies. We think in the short term, hopefully this year, we'll have the negative outlook lifted, and then that will lead us to a higher bond rating a couple of years down the line. Wall Street looks for stability. They don't want to see wild gyrations, as you can imagine, because this is investors who are deciding how to invest their money and what kind of paper. And if Westchester shows that we've gotten back on the gold standard track, then we will benefit from a higher bond rating.
All right. How do local governments benefit from this program?
Well, we've agreed to share 30% of the revenue, the new revenue, back to all of the towns, all of the villages, and the 2 cities that don't have their own sales tax. So there's 45 municipalities in Westchester County. The 4 big cities each have their own sales tax: Yonkers, Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, White Plains. They're not part of the program either way. They'll benefit when we have a property tax freeze at the county level, because that'll benefit everybody all across the county. But the remaining communities, the towns and the villages, if people are watching from Greenburgh, it means all 6 villages and then the overall town of Greenburgh as well. Plus, as this is shown in any town, any village, all a part of this. 30% back of the total revenue, 20% of it to the general governments, 10% to the school districts. And we came out with estimated numbers for this year, and it's a significant number. I gave you the numbers a second ago for Greenburgh. An additional $1 million within the current budget year. So, Supervisor Paul Feiner and the members of the council have a budget. It's adopted. It's balanced. Here comes, before the end of the year, an additional $1 million. Now, you can put that in your reserve. You can fix the roads a little better. You can do a lot of things with it. But that's up to the town and the villages to make those decisions. We've provided a revenue stream for local governments that they haven't seen from anybody in the last 20 years. We did that by taking this bold move. The school districts will get an additional 10% of the total amount of revenue, so that over the course of a regular year, that probably amounts to about $14 million being shared. School districts are pretty big governmental entities. They're usually bigger than the local towns.
Usually strapped for money.
And they're usually strapped for money. But school districts get additional money every year from Albany. Local governments do not. So that's why we erred on the side of the local government. But we think this is going to be helpful to the school districts as well. And to be candid with you, as I go around the county, I'm seeing town supervisors and village mayors coming up to me saying, "You didn't forget us. You included us in." And this is part of the overall narrative of this administration. We're working cooperatively with people. In a climate in Washington where people are at each other's throats, we're working, Republicans and Democrats, legislators and executives, county government and local governments, we're working together about as cooperatively as you've seen it anytime recently.
Are there any rules or strings attached once they get the money?
No, there isn't. It's the discretion of each local government. Most local governments want to do the same thing we're going to do, which is try to keep your property taxes as low as possible. In some cases, there are some significant capital projects that are needed to be done, and this will be manna from heaven in those particular cases. But I think everybody, and particularly with this discussion of a coming recession, I think people are going to be very conservative in the way they handle their budgeting, and I think it'll be to the benefit of the taxpayer.
So just very quickly, the way you prepare your budget now with this new legislation, if I follow you, there's not going to be any one-shot deals.
That's correct.
You won't have to do that. And now, did you sign an executive order to prohibit the selling from parkland?
Yes. What we did was, Assemblyman Tom Abenanti, who represents
Right.
Greenberg, longtime friend of mine, he made the case that there was a legislative loophole created in the state government that would allow Westchester to move parkland into being sold without having to go through the normal process which requires the state legislative approval. And I agreed with Tom and others that we didn't want that loophole to exist. I've served in the state legislature. That is an important protection for everyday people, that parkland won't be misused by whomever is the executive or the county legislature of the moment. So what I did do is I said to Tom that if they didn't pass a law in Albany to protect it, I would issue an executive order which would restrain the county from using that side path as a protection until they could pass a state law. Their hope is that next year in 2020, when they go back to legislative session, they'll be able to pass the law, in which case my executive order is irrelevant. But it shows you again that I try very hard to make a commitment and to live up to the commitment. This is no effort to just blow smoke. We told Tom and Assemblywoman Amy Paul and Assemblyman David Buchwald we would be good to our word, and we would make sure that we weren't going to abuse this opportunity on parkland. And the whole issue of the one-shot has gone away because we now have the revenue stream and we don't have to use the gimmicks. But at the end of the day, my interest was in keeping property taxes as stable as possible.
All right, since this relates to the budget, I want to cut into this aspect before we get into Playland. Westchester sees an uptick in spending on roads and infrastructure. Now, I can attest, as a person living here, that definitely with the roads and a lot of infrastructure, I'm not going to question you on the need for it. But how is this going to fit into your? I mean, are you going to be able to balance your budget? Because I think last year you approved the borrowing of $220 million for work, and in 2019, lawmakers have already approved $160 million, with more projects being discussed. I understand at the last legislative meeting in July, they approved $25 million in bonds for road work alone. I think including $13 million for Mamaroneck Avenue in White Plains, Harrison, and Mamaroneck. And they may have done this already. There's an expected vote on $1.4 million worth of work onto Farragut Avenue in Hastings.
Right. So all these, Dennis, are necessary projects. But more importantly, the thing to keep in mind is this, as it relates to your own home budget. You get a paycheck if you make, $70,000 a year. If you make $70,000 a year, your take-home check is probably in the vicinity of $2,000 a paycheck, 2 paychecks a month. So you have $4,000 a month. If somebody says, oh my God, you're going to pay $150 for cable television, and then you're going to pay for $3,000 for your monthly mortgage payment, and then you've got to pay $150 a month for your car, are you going to go over your budget? No, you've created a budget. And within that budget, where you know you've got $4,000 in revenue, you've allocated $3,000 to pay for the mortgage, so much a month for this, so much a month for that. Every one of these costs that you've identified has been part of a capital budget that was approved last year, scrutinized by the Board of Legislators, open to public discussion, available to the press, open public meetings, and the public could come in and comment. Some did, most didn't. We had, for the first time last year, and we're going to repeat it again every year in our term, a public hearing about the budget before we finalize the budget to get raw public input about what we think should happen. And so all of these projects you've talked about, all necessary projects, and as you said, you drive around Westchester County, you'll see any number of roads that need repair. Now, not every road is owned by the county. In fact, the county owns the smaller portion of the roadway. Most roads that you and I would drive on are owned by the local government in that area, and it's their capital that has to go into fixing it. But the ones you've mentioned, Mamaroneck Avenue that goes from White Plains to downtown Mamaroneck, that's a county road. and that requires improvement. Bronx River Parkway is probably the most prominent county road that people drive on in this end of the county. And that, of course, is going to require some improvement. But it's within the budget that we approved. And the budget that we improved for 2019 involved a 2% tax increase, very modest increase. What we're looking at for the next 2 years of our administration, I'd like to say 3 years, but I can't be sure, so I'm not going to overpromise. But for the next 2 years, we'll be able to freeze property tax at the county level, not the whole budget, county level, and at the same time continue our capital projects. And keep in mind, when somebody says the project is going to cost $1 million, you're not paying $1 million in that year. You're borrowing that money, and you're paying debt service for that year. So if you pay $1 million over 20 years and you make payments of, I don't know, whatever that number is, something of the 5 multiple for that year, then you're paying 1/20th of the cost of that $1 million with interest attached to it. That's why it's so important to get the bond rating up and get the interest rate a little bit lower. And so you'll be paying for that over time. These are things that we can afford in Westchester County. And keeping in mind that most of the capital projects we have, most of the spending that we do, that we have discretionary, that's the smaller part of the budget. The bulk of what you spend money on in the county is mandated by the state. The whole social service budget, which is by far the biggest department of county government, it's mandated by the state. We run a prison. We may not use the prison, thankfully, or the probation department that goes with it, but that's mandated by the state of New York. We have to have a corrections department, and we have to have a probations department, and we have a bus system, and all those things. That all fits in together.
Okay, just one thing, and I'm not asking you to spend a lot of time because we didn't even get to these other things, but I think this is all important. And if I got to make 2 programs out of it, I will, because I think you deserve the time.
Well, I appreciate that.
Okay. Like myself, to be honest, when I drive along Westchester, at times I'm not sure which is a county road, which is a government road, which is a state road. Now, you don't have to run for re-election in November, but the Democratic majority does in the county legislature. I assume, how do you educate the average person who may even be working 2 jobs, they're trying to get kids through college? People just see bills, and again, even someone like myself who follows government, I don't always know which is a county road, which is people want to know, how come my bills are so high? What do you tell them politically?
What I tell them, first of all, is if you want to engage for a few minutes, I can explain it to you. But if you want a snap answer like, I'm going to cut this and that's it, then you're not doing the job of being a good citizen. There's a big debate in this society now about who should be a citizen. And to be a citizen is not just to get the benefits of citizenship, the freedom that are protected in the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and in the court system and so forth. But there are obligations with being a citizen, and not just voting once or 2 or 3 times a year. You have an obligation to be engaged and to understand what's happening in your world. That doesn't mean you have to have a master's degree course in government, but you have to think about what's more than just how much am I paying, because there is a cost of things, but there's also a value of things.
Quality of life.
Here's what I would say. I'm not on the ballot this year. But if I were a member of the Westchester County Board of Legislators, decide what either any one of them has advocated for, I would say 2 years ago, the 2 pools at Sprain Ridge Pool were closed, and there was no game plan to open them up. One of them opened up for 6 months, and then it turned out that it was rushed in its opening and it had to be reconstructed. The other pool was Nowheresville. Where is it today? Both pools are open, being used by people and used productively. We had for 7, 8 years a debate over a mandated responsibility to providing a new family court in New Rochelle. No progress, no action. We were on the verge of being fined by the Office of Court Administration. What do we have now? We have a lease in place. We have a game plan in place. We had a community development block program, grant program. Our friends in Elmsford who may be watching this, they're going to benefit at one of their local parks for $70,000 of federal money to fix up a park. That community development block program died for 5 years because this county government was in war with the Housing and Urban Development. We ended that war. We worked out an amicable way to go forward. We reestablished the community development block grant program. People like Tarrytown and Elmsford and so forth got involved in it, and now they're getting federal money they didn't get before. We've re-energized Playland, and we talk about it in some greater detail.
Right.
It's been ignored for 8 years. Now we have a new ride in there. We have art on the boardwalk. We have town days, more concerts. We're not there yet, but we've seen a big increase in attendance this year over last year as we turn the corner. Here's what it comes down to, Dennis. There's a philosophy that says, don't bother me with government or anything else, just don't cost me any more money. And for some people, that's a philosophy. They attach to a political party, they attach to an ideology. I don't believe that. I believe that there's a public interest involved in what government does. And for all of the times we sit around over a beer, a cup of coffee, they're all crooks, they all don't care. It's simply an easy way to avoid us having to do our responsibility as a citizen. I ran for this job late in my life, okay? The day I got elected, I was the oldest person ever to be elected to this position. I could have just as easily said, you know what, it's about time for me to wrap it up. I've got grandkids. I have other things I could be doing with my life. But I felt that the county needed to go in a different direction. Not out of anger, not out of maliciousness or personal animosity to anybody, but that is exactly what we've done for the last 18, 19 months. It'll be 2 years by November. And when you go to the polls and you look at your choices for county legislator, you decide which individual is the best individual for you. But if I were an incumbent county legislator, and I would argue of either party, I would argue in the last 2 years we've started to fix things that were broken. The Miller House on Virginia Road, that building was going to collapse, and anybody who passed by it knew it. George Washington was there during the Battle of White Plains, and we don't have enough respect for our American history. We call ourselves patriots, and we fly the flag, but George Washington helped save this nation in part by what he did in that building in the Revolution. We let it collapse?
Yeah.
No. We invested the money. We got some money from the state. We're doing the right thing.
All of our programs can be seen on our website online free at www.thedennisrudenshow.com, www.profilesandissues.com. Our programs are also broadcast on Optimum Cablevision and Verizon Fios throughout Westchester County. Check your calendar for day, time, and for day and time and date. All right. Please send us your comments about the show on facebook.com/The Dennis Rudin Show, or email me at profile.issue@yahoo.com. But you got to check out our Facebook. It's brand new. We have everybody on here, you, everybody, and the picnic, the whole crew. This is Dennis Rudin saying so long for Profiles and Issues.